shadow cabinet members have reportedly told Keir Starmer he should kick out of his party 11 Labour MPs who recently signed a Stop the War coalition statement. This is despite the fact that they withdrew their signatures when the leadership threatened to remove the whip. One of those members told Sky News, "At the next election, it won't be Ed Miliband in Alex Salmond's pocket, it'll be Keir in John McDonnell's. There's no chance of even a minority government if the Tories make that argument. We know what the public thinks about the prospect of these people being in charge of our security because they told us in 2019. So the reference to Alex Salmond is a reference to this Tory ad from the 2015 election. It depicts Ed Miliband in the pocket of Alex Salmond and was intended to incite a fear that a Labour minority government in coalition with the SNP would actually be controlled by Edinburgh. We might all get social democracy like they seem to be aiming for up there. So in this scenario, in this new updated version of Salmond, or Ed Miliband being in Salmond's pocket, how would John McDonnell and other members of the Socialist Campaign Group exert a malicious influence on a Labour government? Well, given the present situation, the focus is on security, hence the demand that Labour MPs distance themselves from Stop the War or lose the whip. Today, for example, John McDonnell withdrew from a Stop the War meeting after threats were reported in the media that he would lose the whip if he spoke. But we need to ask, what is so bad about Stop the War? Well, the statement signed by the 11 MPs actually didn't contain any extreme positions. It condemned any war with Ukraine and called for a diplomatic solution while also criticising NATO's eastern expansion. It's a position which a week ago would have been completely unremarkable, with a focus on NATO being widespread in academic circles and even former colonels in the US military.
Here is Colonel Doug McGregor, a former senior advisor to the Secretary of Defense. Thank you for joining us. Why do you think Putin is doing this? What is his end game?
Well, Vladimir Putin is carrying through on something that he's been warning us about, at least for the last 15 years, which is that he will not tolerate U.S. forces or their missiles on his borders, much as we would not tolerate Russian troops and missiles in Cuba. And we ignored him, and he finally acted. He was not going to allow Ukraine under any circumstances to join NATO.
That position held by the former US colonel is not an outlier. It's common, and it's only in our new McCarthyite climate that it's become unsayable. But sadly, Starmer is buying into this McCarthyism. He recently told Labour MPs there will be no place in this party for false equivalence between the actions of Russia and the actions of NATO. Again, it's a completely vague thing to say. I think probably intentionally vague. Obviously, anyone who says, oh, NATO's offer for Ukraine to join them is worse or as bad as Putin aggressively invading the whole country with imperialist ambitions, obviously that would be ridiculous. But if you say that one of the causes of this situations is NATO, then you'll get Keir Starmer saying, they're blaming NATO and they're absolving Putin. No, this is a terrible hole for us to get into when it comes to discussing complex issues such as foreign policy. But being fairly blunt, being fairly cynical, fits a pattern. Keir Starmer's response to Europe's first war in 2 decades has been cynical from start to finish. Instead of dealing seriously with the complexities of war, Starmer has used it as an opportunity to bash the left and talk tough. A recent article in the FT gave an idea as to why. So they write, 2 things are driving Starmer. First is a total focus on winning back so-called red wall seats in former English heartlands where defence issues are salient. The party's strategists have concluded they must revert to the stances adopted when Tony Blair led the party and, politically speaking, wrapped himself in the flag. They say Starmer's other motivation is simple: power. When he was elected leader, he privately told supporters he may be a figure akin to Lord Neil Kinnock, who fought the left in the 1980s but failed twice at the ballot box. Yet as Johnson's standing has waned due to the Partygate scandal, Starmer's ambitions have grown. Keir has had a sniff of power, one shadow minister explains. He privately thought the odds were too great. Now he can see a route to number 10. Why would you brief that someone's had a sniff of power? It doesn't make them sound like a particularly relatable person. It makes them sound like they're power crazy. But anyway, of course, all this means that none of these statements from Keir Starmer are about NATO, let alone about Ukrainians. This is about electoral positioning. And Keir Starmer hasn't just shown himself to be a cynic here. He's also shown himself to be a coward. The Independent reports that at a service at a Ukrainian Orthodox church in Acton, a member of the congregation asked Starmer to urge the government to support a no-fly zone. In response, Keir Starmer said, "We'll talk to the government about that." The congregant was delighted, but unlike Johnson, who explained the impossibility of a no-fly zone to a Ukrainian face-to-face, Starmer left it to a spokesman to tidy up after him. Keir Starmer did make clear that he would pass on the concerns about the tragedy that is happening in Ukraine to the UK government, and we know that one of the concerns is that of Russian air power. Labour fully agrees with NATO that a no-fly zone is not an option, as it would bring NATO and Russia into a direct conflict. So when he's faced with a Ukrainian who very understandably is asking, can I have a no-fly zone? Keir Starmer says, oh, I'll put that to the government. Really? He knows that would be a disaster. He knows that could lead to nuclear war. So he leaves it to the spokesman afterwards to give a statement to the newspaper. Oh, of course, we don't support NATO expansion. But Keir Starmer's going to bring it up with Boris Johnson anyway. Why? Was it because he wasn't brave enough to speak the truth when he was at that visit? Is it because he's a coward?
For Keir Starmer, it's his internal political project within the Labour Party of, stoking up a red scare and purging anti-imperialist factions from within the party. And so in order to do that, we see this absurd simplification, not only of the situation that we are seeing in Ukraine right now, but of the anti-imperialist position. They are trying to portray the anti-imperialist position as, naive or as coming from the position that the US and the UK are the only imperial powers. Of course, that is absolutely not reflective of the broader anti-imperialist position in the Labour Party or otherwise. And if that position is represented, it is very, very marginal, and it is not held by any of those MPs that signed that letter. We know that any anti-imperialism that is worth its salt is against all imperialism, and also understands that imperialists of different stripes actually are not really positioned as much ideologically in opposition with one another, but actually rely on each other in many ways to bolster their own legitimacy and power. And it's actually an anti-imperialist analysis that can give us insight into how you can actually create a world where we don't end up in this state of perpetual war and perpetual violence. And yet Starmer is using that very crude simplification and flattening in order to continue an internal political project that is, frankly, it's irrelevant on the world stage right now, given what we are going through. And it's leading him to hold, frankly, dangerous positions, dangerous in a kind of minor way in terms of, you could argue whether or not this is minor, but, dangerous to democracy in the Labour Party, but also just dangerous, full stop. For the reasons that you just outlined, we know, pushing for a no-fly zone, which I don't think Starmer would actually do, but trying to put that on the table as a possible thing that might happen is incredibly dangerous, could have incredibly dangerous consequences. And so the idea that you would sort of fling that into the public discourse in order to project a certain image of yourself and the post-Corbyn Labour Party as hawkish, as socially conservative, etc., and in order to provide cover for the removal of the last socialist MPs in the party, that's incredibly reckless, especially as we know that he knows the potential impacts of this, and that he doesn't actually mean it in any kind of serious way. And that is an absolutely reckless use of his power as the head of one of the two main parties of the British state. And it's also a disrespect to the Ukrainian people in many ways to weaponize their struggle and to weaponize the conditions that they are living under in order to play party politics within the Labour Party.